The Palestinian refugee crisis has sent shockwaves through the Middle East, with ripple effects reaching all the way to Europe. As over 6 million Palestinians are displaced, countries like Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon are grappling with the consequences. Egypt's massive wall at the Gaza border is just one example of how nations are trying to contain the crisis. But what does this mean for Europe, already struggling with its own immigration challenges? In this video, we'll explore how this humanitarian disaster is reshaping the Middle East and what it could mean for Europe's future. In 2024, amidst the chaos of the Gaza conflict, Egypt built one of the most fortified border barriers in the world.
Well, Egypt has been stepping up its number of checkpoints along its border with Gaza.
Not to keep out Israel, but to prevent the flood of Palestinian refugees from crossing into its territory.
No displacement. People will not be allowed to go to Sinai.
Behind this wall, over 1 million Palestinians are trapped, while neighboring Arab nations face a dire choice: open their borders and risk destabilizing their fragile economies and societies, or close them and exacerbate one of the largest humanitarian crises in modern history. Egypt's decision to build this extensive wall, covering the Gaza border, has been officially justified as a logistical solution for aid delivery. However, this barrier has raised significant concerns and tensions, particularly given the deep-seated rivalry between Egypt and Israel. The wall's purpose remains controversial, with official statements framing it as a measure to alleviate congestion rather than to deter refugees. Do you think the wall between Egypt and Gaza is a good strategic decision, or is it an unnecessary waste of money? Egypt, between Israel and Hamas. But the truth is that there are documents and reports that demonstrate a deep tension behind this border fortress. At the moment, Egypt is trying to de-escalate the conflict with Israel, although the conflict is eroding their relations. In June, Israeli forces conducted an exercise in Rafah, causing a clash between forces from both countries, culminating in the loss of life of an Egyptian soldier.
Egyptian soldier has been killed in an exchange of fire with Israeli forces.
A member of Egypt's security forces that was killed on a Monday.
But behind this small skirmish, which supposedly happened due to a misunderstanding, lies a more sinister plot. According to some sources close to the Egyptian government, Israeli intelligence had designed a plan to evacuate some 2.5 million Palestinians to Egypt, causing what could be a devastating effect on the country's economy and social peace. The greatest concern is that, if a flow of refugees to Egypt is created, members of Hamas and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, both fundamentalist groups that reject the Egyptian government regime, will enter. At the same time, the Arab country believes that allowing the unrestricted entry of refugees can lead to a deep crisis of insecurity, terrorism, and social chaos. Jordan, the most affected country. Jordan is probably the most affected country due to the migration crisis, having received more than 2 million Palestinians during the beginning of the conflict in 2023. But in 2024, it decided to completely change its policy and no longer allows the entry of more refugees.
No refugees in Jordan, no refugees in Egypt.
Since these represent almost 25% of the total population. Imagine that your country receives 25% of its population as refugees. Could it contain their needs? How do you think it would affect its economy? In the case of Jordan, the answer is simple. The country cannot respond to the needs of refugees who, for the most part, live in camps, in overcrowded conditions and, in many cases, without access to food on a daily basis. This has not only cast a critical shadow over the Jordanian authorities' handling of the crisis, but threatens to destroy its social stability amidst a series of crises including the civil war in Syria, the conflict in Gaza, and the economic instability of the region. Why do Kuwait and Lebanon prefer not to receive refugees? The case of Kuwait is particularly interesting, since the country has a rigid stance of solidarity with Palestine and deeply opposed to Israel. And while it has sent humanitarian assistance to those in need in Gaza, its internal stance on refugees is not one of open arms. To reside in Kuwait, Palestinians must obtain a valid work permit and a sponsor. The kafala system, which ties legal residency to an employer, exacerbates vulnerabilities as it leaves people at the mercy of their sponsors and exposed to exploitation and abuse. Furthermore, discrimination permeates several facets of daily life, from employment to access to healthcare and education. Palestinians on work visas are denied access to public services, forcing them to turn to expensive private alternatives. The role of these sponsors, known as kafil, further complicates the situation. If a sponsor fails to guarantee a person's residency, this often leads to their removal from the country. This aspect of the sponsorship system can leave people at the mercy of the whims of their sponsors, with little legal protection or recourse. Cases of abuse of the sponsorship system by fake companies add to the problems faced by foreign workers, including Palestinian refugees. The truth is that Kuwait's idea is to discourage Palestinians from trying to take refuge in their country. The biggest reason for this is the deep resentment that exists in Kuwaiti society against the Palestinians, who supported Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1991. In this conflict, known as the Persian Gulf War, Saddam Hussein attempted to capture the Kuwaitis' oil reserves while seeking to avoid the payment of a financial debt that Iraq had with the Kuwaiti government. At that time, Palestinians represented a large part of Kuwait's population, including holding political office. Their support for Hussein earned them deep hatred from the natives, who expelled the Palestinians at the same time as the Iraqis. That wound has not yet healed, and it reduces the chances of Palestinian refugees finding a temporary home in the neighboring country. On the other hand, the Kuwaiti government assures that fundamentalist Islamist organizations seek to impose a religious government in the territory, and giving unrestricted access to refugees could facilitate the growth of extremist terrorism. For its part, Lebanon has historically contained hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and currently has 12 refugee camps on its territory. But this country has its own internal crises, and giving asylum to so many people represents an enormous cost, especially in food and health. But a huge recession and job loss in the country has led the government to ban refugees from working in more than 70 professions, which in turn leaves the few Palestinians who are able to work unable to support themselves, and most of them must rely on social care. At the same time, Israel does not rule out attacking the territory due to the growing conflict with Hezbollah, a Lebanese Islamist paramilitary group that has found allies in Hamas and the PLO. The demonstrations by some refugees of wanting to fight against the Israelis in Lebanon itself has led a large part of the population to want to expel them, since a large-scale war would compromise the lives of millions of people who do not share the same political and religious perspective as those extremist groups. How will the Palestine crisis impact Europe? As the Palestinian refugee crisis escalates, the implications for Europe become increasingly alarming. The situation in the Middle East is reaching a boiling point, with a looming threat of creating a crisis corridor, similar to what was seen during the Syrian civil war. Back then, Syria's internal conflict triggered an exodus that not only displaced millions of Syrians, but also affected Palestinian refugees who had sought safety there. Now, with other Middle Eastern nations facing their own humanitarian crises, the risk of a continuous flow of refugees grows. If these countries cannot control their critical situations, Europe might soon face an unstoppable wave of migrants, further destabilizing their already fragile social climate. Western nations are already struggling with their own immigration issues. As the Middle East spirals into further instability, Europe could see an unprecedented surge in refugees, straining resources and potentially fueling political unrest within its borders. With the Palestinian refugee crisis reshaping the dynamics in the Middle East, how should Europe prepare for the potential new waves of migration? What strategies should be adopted to balance humanitarian responsibilities with national security concerns?